Dennis O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. New Zealand First will also support this bill, at least as far as the Select Committee, when we'll take another look at it to see if we can support it further. And that's because it addresses some of the most urgent changes that are needed to transport law currently, and especially through effective deterrence for fleeing drivers, which is a very urgent issue, and creating a level regulatory playing field for all small passenger vehicle operators, including Uber. And that's a pretty contentious issue at the moment as well. But we in New Zealand First do have some reservations and criticisms, which I will come to in a moment. But I just want to go through the various parts of the bill bit by bit. And the first relates to the mandatory alcohol interlocks, because as we know, currently it is discretionary as to whether alcohol interlock sentences are imposed on first-time offenders with high alcohol levels and offenders with repeat drink-drive convictions. Now, this bill is going to make that mandatory for those offences. And we in New Zealand First applaud that. That is exactly the right thing to do. And I observe that overseas experience shows that alcohol interlock devices result in an average improvement in terms of offending of 60%, and that's spectacular. So this is one of those examples when modern technology can be used to reduce offending. So this is great. I'm glad to see that in this bill. We also applaud measures to assist enforcement officers in dealing with cases of fare evasion. And as people in Auckland know, Auckland train services are notorious for free riders. Notorious for it. And that's got to stop. Currently, it is an infringement, of course, to free ride, but there is no way that the enforcement officers can enforce it because they can't require the offenders to give names or addresses, and therefore they can't really do much effectively about it. So what the bill is going to do is to create new powers which will enable those officers to require passengers who have not got a ticket to prove they've paid a fare to either give the name and address so that they can be prosecuted, or to actually be ordered to disembark from the service. And it will be an offence for a person to fail to comply with that as well. Police officers can, of course, be called to deal with the stroppy offenders in that respect. So it's good to see that that sort of issue is also finally, after all these years, being tackled. And I think that you'll see an improvement in the quality of Auckland train services as a result. The next issue is the increases to penalties for drivers who fail to stop for police. And as I've already said, that's a very urgent current issue, and something really does need to be done about that. And like Gareth Hughes said, I noted what Victoria University criminologist John Pratt said about that. Quote, "I don't think that it, meaning penalties, will have much effect on these particular cases because people who do these sorts of things for the most part are likely to be young men who don't have much to lose in the first place." Well, Mr Speaker, they'll have a lot to lose if they lose their vehicle as a result of that behaviour, and they'll have a lot to lose if there was a possibility of losing their freedom through an additional penalty of imprisonment for the worst cases. So I don't agree with the Professor. I think, and we in New Zealand First think, that very tough penalties are one of the most important things you can do about this problem. And I read what is proposed here. The mandatory driving disqualification for first-time offenders will increase from 3 months to 6 months. That's not enough, Mr Speaker. 3 months to 6 months disqualification for first time isn't enough. There can be some pretty bad examples even from first offenders. That should be up to 1 year, we believe. And it goes on to say that there would be another offence for a second conviction and this is where it involves speeding or driving in a dangerous manner, and the penalty then would be mandatory disqualification for 1 year. Now, we think that should be at least 2 years, perhaps more. And it goes on to refer to third and subsequent offences of that kind, increase from 1 year to 2 years. That really, really is far too light, far too light. We think that should be up to 4 years. And in addition to that, we believe at that point you should start to impose the possibility of imprisonment. This is a very serious offence we're talking about. And we're talking about third and subsequent offences. That has to be deterred by really strong sentences. Imprisonment has to be a possibility. Then the young people will have something to worry about. So we'd like to see that happen. After all, you know, people are dying as a result of this. And I'm going to read another thing that I saw in the I think it was the Dominion today. And it gives the figures. Overall, fleeing drivers were involved in 29 deaths. That's of themselves or of others in the 5 years to 2014-15. 29 deaths. And there were 2,735 fleeing driver incidents in the 2014-15 year. And that's an increase in 1 year of 371. So it shows you that it's not only serious, but it's getting worse, and it's getting worse rapidly. So we say we want much stronger penalties with the possibility for the worst offenders of imprisonment. Now, just moving on to the updates for heavy vehicle regulation, I think you've got to look at this in context of these changes. We don't oppose any of these changes, but you have to think about it in the context of what's been happening in recent times, where we're getting more very heavy vehicles, I think far too heavy, far too long, huge vehicles on our roads, capable of doing extraordinary damage to the roads, to the bridges, and of course has serious ramifications for safety as well. So looking at these provisions, that's fine, the provisions themselves are fine, but if it's going to be an excuse because you've got these harsher compliance requirements, that we can have even heavier and longer vehicles on the roads, then on behalf of New Zealand First, I want to express the most serious possible reservations if that's the ultimate effect on that. And finally, Mr. Speaker, I want to talk about the regulatory system for small passenger services. And what we're really talking about here is what's happened as a result of the introduction of Uber. And I agree with what is stated in the introduction to this bill, that it's silly to have separate rules for taxis, private hire services and shuttles, and we should have one set of regulations covering them all. It is important that there's a level playing field, and that's what most of the taxi drivers really complain about. Uber getting away with what they call blue murder, and I agree with that, whereas the taxi drivers have to comply. I want to particularly, in my last minute or so, mention two things that we will oppose, because amongst the proposals will be to remove a number of the current regulatory requirements. One of those is the requirement for mandatory signs on vehicles. I think they should stay, and I think Uber vehicles should have them mandatory signs on them as well. Everybody needs to know whether this is a taxi, whether this is an Uber service, because that assists in enforcement and assists them in being identified. So that's important. So we'll be opposing that particular provision. And secondly, we would oppose the removal of the requirement for an operator to belong to an approved taxi organisation. We think, again, that's one of the best ways you can enforce the level playing field, because if you're a member of an organisation, there's a way to identify those people. Those organisations help with the maintenance of standards. They help with tracking people for income tax purposes, and that's another thing that Uber doesn't provide very well. So those are two things we'll be opposing, but we're going to have a very close look on the rest of those provisions as well. We don't oppose the level playing field. the single regulatory system, but there are things within that that need looking at, and we're going to look very closely at it.